very happy to be live with Martin Edwards to talk about his new book, Life of Crime. Do you want to give us an introduction to yourself and your books before we start, Martin?
Fine, thanks, Caroline, and thanks very much for having me. It's always great to see you and the others who do such great work on UK Crime Book Club. It's a fantastic initiative. My name is Martin Edwards. I've published 21 novels. There's a new one coming out next month called Blackstone Fell, set in the 1930s. But I also write non-fiction as well, and it's non-fiction mainly about crime writing. And the book we'll be talking about mainly today is called The Life of Crime. It's a history of crime fiction, the first major crime history, I think, for about 50 years. So it's been a long-term project. It covers crime writing across the globe and across time as well. It runs to about 250,000 words, but of course, there's a lot to say about crime fiction and the way it's evolved. So that's why it's such a big book, and it was great fun to write, and it's even greater fun to see it actually in existence now and to be able to talk about it.
Now, before we go into that, I can't help myself but ask about the 1930s novel. Is it another Rachel Savanake one?
It is. It's called Blackstone Fell, and it's set in Yorkshire, in the Pennine area of Yorkshire, round about Hebden Bridge. For those of you who know that area, Hardcastle Crags was the main inspiration, and it features Rachel Savanake, and it features a locked room mystery. Why did two men vanish from a locked gatehouse in the village 300 years apart? What happened to them? And that's just part of the story. There's a sequence of mysterious murders at a local sanatorium, rather creepy place that Rachel goes to Yorkshire to investigate. So a book that was a great deal of fun to write. And there's a clue finder at the end of it, which lists the clues in the book. So you can check and see how well you did as a detective, as well as reading the story.
I always do very badly, but I did like your clue finder in the last one.
Thank you. Well, it was great fun to write that first one in Main Hall, and I had a lot of fun with that too. And I think it's the first clue finder that's been published for about 50 or 60 years. So I'm delighted to have brought it back, and I was thrilled by the reaction of people. So that, of course, makes it all worthwhile.
Are those clue finders things that used to appear more often then?
Yes. They first emerged in the 1920s. I talk about them in Life of Crime, and it was part of the idea of playing fair with the reader in the detective story. So the idea after the First World War was that the authors would put the clues in the text, so the reader had a chance to solve the mystery, and then some writers had the idea of putting a challenge to the reader at a certain point in the story. Have you solved the mystery yet? Can you answer these questions? And other writers had the idea of putting a clue finder at the back of the book as a kind of demonstration that they had played fair with the reader, and also to tease the reader with all the clues they might have missed. So that was the idea. It continued in the 1930s. There were one or two after the Second World War, but it kind of died out as fashions in fiction changed. But I thought it was time to revive it.
So that's something you've revived. Is there anything else you think that sort of modern crime writers could learn from the history of crime fiction?
Oh, I do. I think both writers and readers can learn a great deal from history. As in life, we can learn from history. We can try to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past for a start, but we can also learn positive things. I think that it can enhance the pleasure that we have in reading a book if we understand how stories have evolved and how things that some publishers might claim are brand new and original are actually fresh versions of ideas that have been around for a very long time. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think this is part of the joy of writing, that you take a concept that's been around for a long time and you reinvent it for the modern age. And if you think of a terrific book like The Appeal by Janice Hallett, that's a very contemporary story, but it's in the Golden Age tradition. And if you read The Life of Crime, you see that there's mention of a couple of books from 1930 which had ideas that are reworked, maybe not consciously, but ideas tend to crop up generation after generation, and writers, inventive writers, take them and do fresh things with them, as Janice Hallett has done in that great bestseller. And I think that's one of many examples. I think knowing a bit about the history of crime fiction can help you if you're writing, but it can also, as I say, I think, increase your enjoyment as a reader. So you see things being done afresh and reinvented for the modern age. And there's something rather appealing in recognizing what the author has done and appreciating it if it's done well.
So you know how we get sort of trends coming back in like fashion and
Yeah.
music and things? Do we get the same
Yeah.
thing happening in crime fiction?
Oh, I think absolutely, Caroline. That's very true. There are fashions in writing, and specifically in crime writing, as there are in pretty much every other aspect of life. And certainly the books that I was writing in the 1990s, which a series set in Liverpool featuring a character called Harry Devlin. My idea with those stories was to have a gritty modern setting in urban Liverpool, but then golden age plots, and those books were very enjoyable to write, and they did well. But the one thing that never happened was that the critics never talked about the golden age elements. It was all about gritty Liverpool and the characters and so on, which was fine. But I think that I did become a bit frustrated that I was putting quite a lot of effort into reworking the golden age ideas, and nobody seemed to take any notice. And that, I think, with hindsight, was because the golden age stuff that I enjoyed back then was not critically fashionable, so people didn't pick up on it. Whereas now, with the Rachel Savanate books, luckily for me, things have moved on, and there's much greater interest in that kind of writing. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, I think. But the enthusiasm that people have for the well-crafted puzzle plot seems to me to be much greater. And the fact that critics appreciate it more than they seem to do in the past is also interesting. But from my point of view, as somebody who's always been keen on these puzzle plots, as well as modern fiction and stories that emphasise place and character, for me, it's particularly rewarding.
So locked room mysteries seem to be quite a current buzz
Yeah,
in crime at the moment. When did they
yeah.
first appear?
Well, Lottery Mysteries go back really pretty much to the beginning of the detective story with Edgar Allan Poe in the 1840s. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is most people say is the first actual detective story, was a locked room mystery. You know, this corpse is found terribly murdered in a locked room, and that was uh, really the story that set the ball rolling as far as locked room mysteries were concerned. They became especially fashionable during the Golden Age, which of course was when there was a great enthusiasm for very complex puzzles and elaborate labyrinthine mysteries. And then around the time of the Second World War, they seemed to go out of fashion. And there's a very good history, American history of crime fiction, published in the 1940s, where the author says, in effect, locked room mystery is dead and gone. But, 75 years later, you're right. These stories are coming back. They're coming back on TV, even in film, and definitely in novels as well. And I think that illustrates that when people say that a type of writing is dead and gone, what they really mean is it's fallen out of fashion. But a good writer can make something fresh with a classic trope, a classic concept. And back in the 90s, with Jonathan Creek on the television, which was a series I really loved, that was one of the first things I think where the locked room mystery was reinvented for modern audiences, and it was incredibly popular. And since then, they've really come back in a big way, and I'm delighted to see it.
We're going to veer away from the sort of history of crime for a moment, because Andrew's asked you a question.
Please, yeah, fire away.
He wants to know if you have to start your books from the first one, so the first Harry Devlin, or can readers dive in anywhere in the series?
Well, it's a good question, and to some extent, of course, it's about personal taste. I can tell you one thing, which is this: um, I am very conscious that people often come into a series midway through, and so with every book I write that is in a series, I do spend quite a bit of time thinking about how I walk that tightrope, because on the one hand, you don't want to irritate your loyal readers who've been with you from day one by just rehashing a lot of information they already know, repeating yourself. But on the other hand, you need to give something to the new reader who isn't familiar with these situations. And that's quite a challenge, but I do think about it. And so in every book, whether it's the Lake District books or in the past the Liverpool books, or certainly the Rachel Savonate books, where there's a big major twist towards the end of the first book, Gallows Court, I do devote quite a lot of thought to how to walk that tightrope. And I've been very interested to ask some readers what they feel about that and how they feel I'm doing. Because I think feedback for writers is very useful. You know, if sensible readers think that something isn't quite working, it's a good idea to take that into account. So I try to factor in any constructive feedback into the way that I approach the writing of the next book.
Good answer. I think I started the Rachel 7-8 series wrong, if that makes sense. I started with with Mortmain Hall and then went backwards.
Yeah. But I like to think that those are, I think we agree, are two very different books. They're written in a different way, and whilst there is the big reveal in Gallows Court, I did try as hard as I could in the situation to make Mortmain Hall work for a first time reader.
It did. It worked really well for a first time, and it didn't spoil my enjoyment going back and reading the
Right.
first
Well,
and second, if that makes sense.
well, yeah, it does make sense. And obviously, I'm delighted because, as I say, I do think about this and try to figure out how to address it in a sensible way.
Oh, some hellos from people as well. So Donna and Tony and Leslie and Sam have all said hello.
Hello to you all. Thanks for joining us.
Donna's asked. Now you've written a long series. Is there anything you wish? Is there anything you wish you'd done differently than when you started?
Well, I had 8 books in the first series, and so far there are 8 books in the Lake District series. The third Rachel book is going to come out, as I say, next month, and I'm writing the fourth one at the moment. I think the short answer is probably not much. I guess in the Lake District series, Miranda, who's the girlfriend of Daniel in book one, nobody has ever told me that they like Miranda, and I may have slightly overdone Miranda because I was very conscious that I wanted Hannah and Daniel to come together in a relationship in the fullness of time. But at the start of the series, they're both in other relationships with other people. And I wanted to make that development reasonable, and also for people not to hate either Hannah or Daniel. But as I say, I may have overdone it because they don't really like Miranda too much, and I think I may have got that slightly wrong. But yeah, just a learning point, I think.
So you said that the sort of history of crime you've written just now, you've sort of
Mm.
looked at it globally. Is there any kind of
Yeah.
is there a particular sort of other countries' crime literature that you really enjoy?
Oh yes, I mean, people often associate me with golden age fiction because I write about it a lot, I talk about it a lot, but I've always liked many different kinds of crime fiction. And I really enjoy books from a whole range of different countries. I'm very keen, for instance, on books from the Far East, some of the Japanese and Chinese books. I was lucky enough to go to the Far East just before the pandemic, and I had a wonderful time meeting loads of fans. I'm still in touch with quite a number of them. That was great. Some of the South American writers, Borges and many others. And then there are places like Australia, which is having a kind of golden age of its own with crime writing at the moment. Africa, all sorts of places. Discovering, now they're being reprinted, some of the golden age stories written in other languages that we never knew about in this country until they were translated. We thought they didn't exist, but they did. And one of the things that has really always fascinated me about crime fiction is the connections that are so unexpected. So yes, we know that Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers and Anthony Berkeley were friendly, they were members of the Detection Club together. But to me, it's at least as interesting to discover the connections between some of those and writers and critics from very different countries and very different times. I went to Chile a few years ago. I went to the house of the poet Pablo Neruda in Valparaiso, and I saw at the top of the house they had a little row of old green penguin paperbacks. I had a look, and there was Anthony Berkeley and Michael Innes. So the great, I think he was a Nobel Prize winner, the great prize-winning poet from South America, was actually a fan of British Golden Age detective fiction. And it's these unexpected links that seem to me to be very interesting and appealing. And quite a lot of the book, particularly in the chapter endnotes, which are very extensive, try to fill in some of the gaps in our knowledge and linking different types of crime writing from different parts of the world and different generations of crime writers, because I do very passionately believe that the things that link us are more important and valuable than the things that divide us. And one of the subtexts of the life of crime is to try to highlight these connections. And I do also very strongly believe that just because I like uh, let's say Agatha Christie or Anne Cleeves, it doesn't mean that I can't like Dashiell Hammett or Borges, the South American writer, or some of the German writers, or Friedrich Dürrenmatt, the Swiss German writer. So it's these connections that really appeal to me, and broadening my horizons as I've read over the years and trying to share some of that information and some of that enthusiasm with people who read the book.
Is there particular loves of different kinds of crime fiction in different countries? You know, like we're having a love of the locked room mystery. Does like the Far East prefer a different kind of crime or?
Well, the locked room mystery is currently very popular in the Far East, and the golden age fiction generally is enormously popular. This was why I was invited to Shanghai a few years ago, and I met Soji Shimada, who's a wonderful man, who's the great sort of doyen of Japanese crime writing. He writes some wonderfully complex locked room mysteries. They're very dark. They're not cozy. They're not in any way cozy. They're very sophisticated, very interesting writer indeed. And to talk to someone like Soji and to spend time with him was a great pleasure. And he has introduced me to other Far Eastern writers. And since then, it's been very interesting and exciting for me to start being published in places like China and Korea and Japan and Taiwan, much in the news at the moment. So that's been a wonderful spin-off as well. And I do think this idea of broadening your horizons is really very appealing.
So one of the things that I love Far Eastern literature. Um, and things, but they're quite sort of open to graphic representations of novels. Like they have a lot of manga that covers a lot of different
Yeah.
genres. Is that a thing you looked into while you were writing your history of crime? Did you look into like the graphic kind of novels and
Only in passing. The book does cover, as well as novels and short stories, it covers TV, film, radio, and even though there's mention of technological developments like apps, interactive apps, where you have a kind of detective game. But there's brief mention of manga and so on, but it's not something I've explored in detail in the book. One of the reasons, of course, being that even 250,000 words, there's a limit to how much you can cover, and you have to be very selective. And although it may not seem like it, I think that is actually a very concise book that moves along. The main historical narrative moves along at quite a pace because I felt there's quite a lot I wanted to cover.
you said you wrote it in quite a different style as well. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you sort of set it out or
Well, Life of Crime. My idea was this: that the history of crime is such an enormous subject. I cover true crime writing as well, in a couple of the chapters. So there's a lot of material to cover, and the big question for me is how do I go about it so that people will want to actually read it, and maybe read it from cover to cover, even though it's a big book, rather than just have it as a sort of reference work or an encyclopedia. That wasn't what I wanted to do. And so what I tried to do was to use my experience as a novelist and to use novelistic techniques to tell it as a story. I did that a few years ago in a book called The Golden Age of Murder, which was just focused on the 1930s and the detection club, and that went down pretty well. So I decided to adopt a similar approach, but on a much larger canvas, if you like. And part of it was to look, uh, not just at the life of crime in terms of a kind of biographical treatment of a crime genre, of the crime genre, but also to look at individual lives of writers and how those lives affected what people wrote, and to use that as a starting point for a wider exploration of the subject. So each chapter and there are 55 or 6 chapters, something like that. Each chapter begins with a short section, which is some incident or episode from the life of a particular crime writer, moving across the years and across the world. And I move from that kind of vivid illustration of a particular point, maybe about how they wrote or something like that, to a wider discussion in the rest of the chapter about similar books or books that were influenced much later on, and so on. And then each chapter has pretty extensive endnotes. They're not kind of academic footnotes, but there's lots of trivia, there's lots of stuff there because I like quirky stuff, bits of information, the stuff about connections I was mentioning, a lot of that is in there too. So each chapter, you can, if you want, you can read it as an individual segment, even if you want to then put the book down and do something else for a while before you come back to it. And I thought that people would want to read it in different ways. Some people would read it from start to finish. Some people would just read the history, that narrative, and ignore the endnotes and then come back to the endnotes. And other people would just dip into particular areas that they were interested in. So it was important to have very extensive indexes, and there are 3 indexes. So there's a main index, but there's also an index to the books and the authors as well. So you can look things up. And that takes up quite a bit of space. It's another reason why it's a large book, but it's also a way of trying to help the reader, whichever way they want to approach this mammoth reading project, to try and get the best out of it.
Tony's got a good question. He says, "You
Go on.
mentioned Murders in the Rue Morgue. Is that classed as the first crime novel, or can the crime novel be traced further back in history?"
Well, in the life of crime, I trace it back further. I trace it back to a book written by an anarchist called William Godwin, the father of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. And he wrote a book called Caleb Williams, which is kind of his reaction to the French Revolution. And he was a revolutionary himself, although in later life he thought better of it when he saw the consequences. But that book, in many ways, and you can always debate which is the first of anything, but in many ways that is a key starting point. So although I talk about things that happened before Caleb Williams in chapter one of the book, Caleb Williams is really where the book begins. As for the Murders in the Rue Morgue, it's a short story. In many ways, it's the first significant detective story. It's one of the first Locked Room mysteries, or there have been one or two before then. And Edgar Allan Poe, the American who wrote the story, although the story is set in Paris, he is the subject of the second chapter. And he was a great influence on many authors, really right up to the present day, and also an influence on people like Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes.
I mean, I guess if you're thinking including kind of writing about true crime as well, you can trace crime writing back to like the Icelandic sagas and things.
Absolutely, and they get a very passing mention as well, I think. But certainly there is quite a connection between real life crime and crime fiction, partly because people write about real life crime, but also because a lot of novelists have written novels or short stories inspired by real life crimes. Yeah, Murder on the Orient Express is one example. It's inspired by the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case. There is a huge connection, and I felt that although it's difficult to do such a big subject justice, I felt I really wanted to say something about true crime and true crime writing and how it intersects with the crime fiction that we all know and love.
There was an interesting series a while ago, wasn't there, that like Simon Tween did, I think, that looked at sort of true crimes that had influenced modern crime writers.
Yeah, it's a big subject, and it is one that fascinates me. It's one I've written about quite a bit, apart from in the life of crime, and it goes on right to this day. You know, there are people like Ian Rankin and Val McDermid who've written very successful books inspired by real life cases, and I'm pretty sure that that's a trend that will continue.
I wonder if that's what draws a lot of ex-policemen into writing crime as well, that kind of
Yeah, possibly so. I think also they often the ex policemen I've talked to, they often tell me they've read various crime novels and they think, yeah, the police procedure isn't as good as it could be, so they would like to do that better, uh, and uh, and that's something that some of them have done very successfully. So I think it's that as well as the interest in real life crime, because of course one thing we have to remember it always is that in life, murder is a very terrible crime. It's pretty horrible. If anyone has ever had any contact on the fringes of murder case, it's a very terrible thing. And so, although crime fiction is an entertainment genre, we have, I think, to treat these things with a degree of sensitivity and remember that what we're writing is fiction. It's not documentary fact. It's a different kind of writing. But sometimes, of course, writing fiction can illuminate issues in life, and I think that's one of the great merits of fiction.
I'm curious how you got involved with the British Library crime classics.
Well, that's one of those lucky chances, really, Caroline. It goes back almost 10 years, and I was copied into some emails with the British Library, I think I'd only ever visited once. I'd had a coffee there with my old friend Anne Cleves. She introduced me to the British Library about 10 or 12 years ago. And I liked the place. And I contacted the guy at the British Library who was involved with an exhibition. And he was also a kind of one-man publications department. And the long story short, we had a coffee together. And he told me that they'd started publishing these books and they weren't doing very well, but he was going to reinvent them with very attractive covers taken from railway poster art, vintage railway posters. And the first two were going to be the Cornish Coast Murder and the Lake District Murder, both written by John Bude, a pretty obscure author. And he asked me to write a couple of introductions, and I agreed, and I wrote the introductions. Really thought no more about it, and I got excited messages saying that the pre-orders, the sales had really taken off, and Waterstones loved the books, and the sales were astonishing, and so it went on from there. And of course, what I'd like to think is it's my erudite introductions, but really it's two things. It's the cover artwork that draws people to the books, and then once people started reading the books, they realised, well, actually, these books may have been out of print for 70 years, but yeah, they're pretty good stories. And so the series has gone from strength to strength. There's over 100 titles now. We had the 100th a few months ago, Death of a Bookseller. I've done, I think I'm on my 20th anthology for the series. So it's been absolutely incredible. None of us would ever have imagined it, but it just came, as far as I'm concerned, from that conversation over a cup of coffee in the British Library. Amazing.
Do you get any say in what gets published by them? Or do you get
Well,
to choose any of the stories or anything?
I'm the consultant to the series, and with the anthologies, I will pitch a concept and a suggested set of stories, and I will put forward more stories than would fit into the book, because sometimes there may be difficulty getting the rights to publish, or the British Library may want a different slant on the contents of some kind, because they look after all the boring stuff like the rights, the permissions, and all that kind of thing. With the novels, I make suggestions, and many of the books I've suggested have been published. But some of the books to this day are books that I haven't suggested, and the British Library takes on board ideas from a whole range of different people who write in and make suggestions, and they're the people who take the final decisions and have the final say. So I'm a kind of unpaid consultant. I'm making suggestions, but they will decide.
So you're also, because you're a multi-talented kind of author, aren't you? You're also part of the Murder Squad. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, the Murder Squad has been going for 21 years, 22 years probably now. Yeah, I think we're in year 22. It began with Margaret Murphy, a Merseyside writer, an old friend of mine, who was feeling that middlist writers didn't get enough support from the publishers, a kind of age-old complaint many writers discussed in the life of crime over the centuries have felt the same. And so she felt it would be good to band together. And what happened was that seven of us got together. There's Margaret, myself, Anne Cleves, Kath Staincliffe, and then Stuart Pawson and Chas Brenchley and John Baker. Now, over the years, it's been a wonderful way of promoting each other as well as promoting ourselves, and we've really enjoyed that. Stuart sadly died, John retired, and Chaz emigrated, although not to flee Murder Squad. I hasten to add, he got married and went to live in the States, and Kate Ellis and Chris Sims joined us. But we've remained very good friends and remained keen on supporting each other. I think one thing that's been quite wonderful is that someone like Anne, who's enormously successful nowadays, is still keen to keep Murder Squad going because she remembers, as the rest of us do, what a good thing it was for us at a time when our careers weren't quite what they might have become in more recent times. And so it's that fellow feeling which you get in the crime writing community, and it's a kind of microcosm of that.
Have you found similar? You've talked about the Detection Club. We've obviously got the Murder Squad now. Have you found other similar groups of crime writers through history, sort of banding together to help themselves? Or
Yeah, very much so, Caroline. And of course, it happens in different ways at different times. So now we have Facebook, and so you have groups like yours, ours. But the Detection Club was the very first social network for crime writers, founded in 1930, at a time when writers didn't know each other. There was no Facebook, no Twitter, no Instagram, no book talk, nothing like that. So how did people cope? Well, they got together in this small dining club. It's always been a very small group. It's just literally just a dining club, a social club, very tiny. It's not a professional organisation like the Crime Writers Association, which came along in the 1950s and which does a great job supporting writers throughout the country and further afield. It was a very small little group of people who got on and just liked chatting over meals. It's not really about self-promotion at all. But it's carried on, and it's now what 92 years old and still hale and hearty, which is I think wonderful. And the heritage of crime writing, of which the Detection Club is a part, is one of the things that has always fascinated me from being a teenager, really. And again, it's one of the reasons why I was so keen to write this history about the genre.
what do you think? So, from being such an avid student of the history, what do you think maybe needs to change now that we have got more of a modern thing? There is a more of an open publishing kind of platform for people.
Well, I think that one of the things that's very interesting, of course, that's happened in the last few years is that technology has moved on, so people can self-publish, and self-publishing is a significant uh, factor in the overall spectrum of crime writing. And there are some very good books that are self-published. There are some authors who are self-published who've sold a colossal number of books. There are some who are self-published who've become very successful traditionally published authors. That it can be a great route for certain writers. So I think self-publishing is very attractive. I think the publishing industry itself is in a state of flux. I think it's wondering what the future holds. Obviously, we've had ebooks, now we've got audio as a very big thing. I think, uh, nevertheless, the paperback seems to be enjoying a resurgence this year, and ebooks seem to be moving down a little bit. Whether that's just a temporary blip or not, I don't know, but that's what I'm told by publishers. So it's very hard to predict. Hardbacks have become better produced, more attractive, so more people are buying hardbacks, and that's very interesting. Whether that will survive the cost of living crisis, we'll have to wait and see. But it's a very interesting development. So the publishing industry has had to adapt, and of course, it's also having to take on challenges about diversity. It's starting to do that. It perhaps needs to continue to work at that to do more, and also as well as supporting and encouraging writers from minorities to remember the writers who've been around for a while, but who may have fallen out of fashion. And I think that the age thing can be perceived by some writers as a problem. And I think that that's perhaps something where publishers may need to do more work in future so that when they say that they're inclusive and diverse, they can actually demonstrate it across the whole spectrum. I think the other thing that's really interesting, to go back to something I was saying before, is the increase in crime in translation. Of course, we had Scandi stories, all those wonderful stories from Northern Europe. But now, as we've mentioned, Japan, China, South America, and this is a development that's opening our eyes to what is out there in the wider world. I think that making these contacts is really exciting and important.
Do you think, what kind of responsibility do you think sort of groups like ours, things like the CWA, and maybe festivals like Harrogate have for kind of reflecting that need for diversity and that broader kind of spectrum of writing?
Well, I think it's something for each organisation or group to work out for themselves. I'm not a great believer in preaching to people about what they should do, because I think that a lot of that goes on in the world already. But I was chair of the Crime Rights Association for quite a long time, over 2 years, which was quite unusual. And one of the specific issues I'll mention that I was very interested in was well-being and mental health of writers, and I started one or two initiatives which I think are being developed further within the CWA, because of course, although it's a great privilege to be a published writer, um, there's quite a number of writers who find life very tough for a whole range of reasons. There's quite a lot of depression. If you Google Simon Brett, my good friend, he wrote a very poignant and influential article on depression in the crime writing fraternity. Well worth a read, that if you can find it on the internet. And so things like that, I think, are well worth thinking about, because for every bestseller that you read about, for every Dagger winner, there's a horde of other writers who are not necessarily having that level of success, and some of them are having a rough time. And so I think that supporting them is something that's very desirable, because one thing is for sure, some of the writers who are having a rough time can be among the finest writers of the generation. So that it's not that they're not writing good books, it's just that something may have gone wrong with their career for whatever reason.
Alex has asked, could you tell us from your vast experience of the genre, what part of the globe we should be looking into for new material or an old classic you would recommend that we should read?
Well, I think that there's, if you like locked room mysteries, that there's a small American press called Locked Room International, who've published in translation quite a lot of locked room mysteries from places like Germany, Italy, France, quite a lot of them, as well as the Far East, and some of the Far Eastern ones being relatively modern, by interesting writers like Alice Arasagawa, who's very, very good, I think. So that's if you're a locked room mystery fan. I think that some of the European writers, many of whom, of course, are now very well known, like Fred Vargas in France, Hakan Nesser, one of the Scandinavian writers. These are well worth exploring if you're not actually familiar with their work. And again, in South America, there are publishers like Bitter Lemon, who are bringing out some very interesting writers that I was previously unfamiliar with. There's one writer, Spanish writer, called Teresa Solana. I think is really good. She's published a number of books, but there are many, many more. So that there is no shortage of wonderful books to look at. It's the real challenge is finding the time to read them all, really.
I discovered a great vein of old, I want to say the old, but they might not be, kind of really good locked room and quite classic Japanese crimes.
Yeah,
That
is that Pushkin Vertigo?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, they've published a number. They published Soji Shimada, who I mentioned before. They've published Tokyo Zodiac Murders, which is one of his most famous books, for instance. And that book was I think first published in the early 80s, but it's not been available in Britain until the last 2 or 3 years. And there are quite a number of those pushed in Vertigo books that are very, very intricate and also entertaining and quite often thought-provoking mysteries, very often drawing on the British Golden Age traditions and often name-checking British Golden Age writers. That always interests me, intrigues me. But doing something different with those older ideas, which, as I said earlier, is something that always fascinates me. I like doing it with the Rachel Savanate books, and writers like Soju Shimada and Arasugawa are doing it in Japan, as are many other authors across the world.
It's one of the things I quite like about graphic novels as well, is they often take sort of those concepts of like classic crime and classic crime characters even and reflect them in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and that's an example of the infinite flexibility, more or less infinite anyway, of the crime story. It's capable of adaptation in many different ways. So you can write radio drama. I've written my first audio drama, which I can't say anything about at the moment. It's all hush hush, but that was great fun to do. It's something quite different for me, and trying to blend traditional detective fiction with something very different. And again, I won't say what it is just yet, but that was a great challenge. But it was also fascinating to try my hand at it. So trying to do something new with existing ingredients is really appealing, I think.
What are your thoughts on things like speculative crime?
Well, I've not written much of it. I did write one story set in the future, a short story, quite a long time ago. It was in an anthology, and it was about a very different futuristic legal system. But of course, speculative fiction and speculative crime fiction can take many different forms. I think that for me, the acid test always with a book is is this. It's really it's not what is the author doing, but are they doing it well? One thing I think one should always try to do, if possible, is to judge a book by the standard of what the author was aiming to do, not what I think uh, he or she might have aimed to do. I think that's a mistake that some critics make. You've got, I think, to try to make an effort to put yourself in the shoes of the author, to figure out what they were aiming to do, and then you can judge how well they achieve it. I think this is true of speculative fiction, but it's true of all fiction, really. You've got to give the author the respect of judging them according to their ambition, not what you believe they should have written, because that's your imposition on their book of your own ideas. I'm not really in favour of that. But I think that speculative crime fiction has a great deal of potential, and I wouldn't mind betting that as we move into the post-pandemic era, we'll see more of it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, is like, because obviously we've had people like Philip K. Dick in the past who've written really good kind of speculative crimes, but that and like urban fantasy as a genre, things like Rivers of London and things, are they things that you've seen in the past, like little hints of magic or
I,
futuristic fiction, or is that quite a new invention?
No, again, it goes back a surprisingly long time. There was an American author. I'm trying to remember. I think it was Randall Garrett. He wrote a number of books in that vein, maybe 50 odd years ago.
What did you say
Uh,
his name was? Randall?
Randall Garrett. I think I'm getting the right guy. I think that's an example. It's a very, very long time since I read them, so I may be mistaken. But Randall, Randall Garrett, 2 R's and 2 T's, if I remember rightly. But and there are other examples as well, which I can't immediately call to mind, going further back. And even very rational writers like John Dixon Carr, the king of the locked-room mystery, he wrote a book called The Burning Court, which seems to have an element which defies rational explanation, which goes against the grain of classic detective fiction. It's almost a supernatural level that he adds to the story. And you get supernatural elements in a lot of classic detective fiction. It turns out there's a rational explanation, but Burning Court is a bit different from that. So very interesting kind of book. And I think that the great thing is this: it's not so much a matter of originality of idea. It's a question of originality of treatment. You may worry if you're a fledgling writer, well, everybody's done everything already, but you can bring your own voice to it, your own attitude, your own background, your own personality, and so it becomes your take on something. And again, you might come up with something that you think is really original. So in my first novel, All Lonely People, written more than 30 years ago, I had this idea of a corpse discovered on a municipal slag heap. It's a kind of comment on 80s Britain, if you like, in a sort of simple way. And I thought that was a very cutting edge thing to write. And then many years later, I came across a book written in the 1930s, which had exactly the same concept, a body in a municipal tip. So, I hadn't been quite as innovative as I fondly imagined, but it didn't matter because I'd done something that worked in the context of my novel. And I think that it's sometimes a mistake to look at two different books from different times and think, well, one author was imitating the other. I think that what often happens is that people get the same idea at different times and then they give it their own spin. And it's only if their own way of dealing with that idea doesn't work that the book fails. The fact that the idea has been around in the past isn't a problem. And as I said earlier, in relation to Life of Crime, I think it's actually very interesting and informative to find out about the ideas that were around in the past that relate to books of the present, because I think in many ways it certainly enhances my enjoyment of those books, and I think it enhances the enjoyment of many readers as well.
I would agree. Tony has asked if that's why authors get knocked back so much, because agents and publishers have a narrow vision of what a crime novel should be like.
Well, I think that there are a number of reasons why authors get knocked back. It may simply be, when Gallows Court was first sent round the publishers, I asked my agent to send it to the 10 best publishers, and one of them wrote back a very nice rejection letter to the agent saying that my platform wasn't quite as impressive as that of one of their other authors. In other words, I wasn't well known enough. I wasn't famous enough. A fair comment, but there can be things like that that are outside your control as an individual author, and it's a mistake to get too wound up about it. I think it's interesting, but it's a mistake to get too upset or grumpy about it, because all you can do is write the best book that you're capable of and keep going and try and find a home for it somewhere. But certainly, and different publishers and different agents will have different priorities. They will always say that they're looking for something fresh and original. As we've been saying, it's not always about originality of idea. It's about some originality of treatment. But even then, they may sometimes find that they lean towards the same old, because they're confident it will sell. And traditional publishing is a commercial industry, and so what sells is very important as far as they're concerned.
I think, and then it also maybe having a narrow view of what sells. I know
Yeah,
that I've read a book that's with someone's agent right now, and it's probably one of the best things I have ever read. And they're struggling to find a publisher because it's a bit cross genre,
yeah,
and they don't
yeah.
want to they don't know how to market it.
Indeed, and that does happen. Two standalones that I wrote years ago. One of them I think is one of the best books I've ever written. It's a book called Dancing for the Hangman, and it's a novel about Dr. Crippen, but seen from his point of view, if you can imagine that. And it stays faithful to the known fact, but it tries to use the novelist's imagination to explain the oddities of that particular story. And I'm very, very proud of that book, but it didn't really hit the moment. It's published by small publishers in the States and here, and it got great reviews, but it didn't sell a lot of copies because it didn't chime in with the zeitgeist, if you like. And there's not a lot you can do about that because if you simply aim to write for the market and what publishers want, one of the drawbacks is that you might find that the market has moved on. And so one thing that I've tried to do over the years, with varying degrees of success, is write books, fiction or non-fiction, that I've really, really passionately believed in. And some of them have done very well. One or two, like the Crippen book, Dancing for the Hangman, didn't do as well. But I do think that in the long run, that approach of writing what you care about and what you believe in, rather than what you think will sell, is the way to go. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily pay the mortgage. So I've had a job. I've had a separate career, which has paid the mortgage over the years until relatively recently. But I think that the benefit that has given me is that I've been able to, for better or worse, to stay true to my vision of what I wanted to be as a writer. And after a very, very long time, it's in recent years, it's been working, reasonably well.
And that's good, isn't it? And I think it's just sad sometimes when you read something that's so good, not
Yeah.
finding its home.
Well,
Like,
that's right. Yeah.
you just want to pick up the publishers and shake them and be like, I'd go to see the movie of this. I'd go to see it several times.
Yeah, well, I absolutely agree, Caroline, but I also think that there's more to it as well, in that this can happen with established writers who write a number of books, and then for whatever reason, maybe the sales figures aren't good because publishers and bookshops are governed by sales figures, and then they get dropped. And I've seen because I've been around for a long time as a crime writer, published crime writer, I've seen come and go many really, really good writers who've actually given up. And this has happened through history. It's not a new thing. I talk about it in The Life of Crime. And I've always been interested in why that is, and can people be encouraged, to stay in the game, because you need to stay in the game in order to have a better chance that one day your luck will turn, as it turned in my case. But not everybody is able to do that, particularly if they're a full-time writer, and money becomes a big problem. And that to me is a very sad thing.
We've got about a minute left.
Time flies.
And well, I think I could talk to you for at least another hour or more about this. It's so fascinating. I don't think I've even asked you all the questions I had in my head. Do you want to finish us off with just a recap of the book we've been talking about, and your other books?
Thanks, Caroline. It's been great fun, and thanks to everybody who's tuned in. The Life of Crime is a history of crime fiction. It's not a dry book. It's meant to be entertaining. The reviews have been fantastic, and even if you're not really into history, if you're into crime fiction, I hope that you'll get a lot of pleasure if you manage to read it. My latest novel, Blackstone Fell, has returned to the Rachel Savanake series, and that comes out in a month's time.
Excellent. And then all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Caroline. I've really enjoyed it.